Hey there, YouTubers. All right, so in this video, we're going to go over a checklist. And basically, what this checklist is about is the things you need to do before you go off and buy an 8th gen Intel chip, just to make sure that your motherboard has the most up-to-date BIOS for the 9th gen chip that you want. Now, as I have done quite a few videos, not necessarily dispelling the rumor that you need an 8th gen chip to update your BIOS for 300 series motherboard to make it 9th gen compatible, because it isn't going to work all the time. But I have done about, I think, 5 or 6 videos now where I've actually put a 9th gen i3, 9th gen i5 in the motherboard and got it to boot up, and when I've actually had Windows already installed on the SSD, it has booted straight up to Windows. So what can be learned from this is that there's certain things you need to make sure you're doing before you go buy that 8th gen chip. Some people are building their very first computer, and so there are some things in there that might actually be done wrong that could cause you to have a blank screen on your monitor. All right, so we're going to tackle those. Then we're also going to look at quite a few things that you could do to research the topic to ensure that the motherboard you are getting will actually either require an 8th gen chip to update the BIOS, or you can just go straight to the 9th gen chip. So let's go through these. I've got I think at least 12 of these. All right, so let's start looking at that checklist. So a lot of these things are basics that anybody should do if they're building a computer, but I'm going to assume some of you are new to building computers, and though these things kind of go hand in hand, they're definitely things to check, as many of them will give you that same feeling. All right, let's look at that checklist. So some of these are going to be so basic. Some of these basically are what you would do if you're building a computer, things you would check. But a lot of them give off that same sense that you would get if you were to put a 9th gen chip in and it didn't boot to BIOS. So let's start with some of the simple stuff. Let's talk RAM. So with RAM, obviously want to make sure that it is seated correctly. You want to also know what your motherboard specifies for if you were to put a single stick of RAM in, where you would put it. Sometimes when you have 4 DIMM slots, it's not always spot number 1. I personally also recommend that you only use 1 stick of RAM in the beginning, because if you happen to have one that's bad, it's going to be one of those things where you're not going to realize it until probably too late. So along those lines, you might want to switch out the RAM to make sure that the RAM you put in wasn't bad. All right, so that's probably about all you need to know about RAM, besides ensuring that it's seated correctly and that it's compatible with your motherboard. Now, with 9th gen, Intel came out with these F-type processors, and we have featured quite a few on this channel. Most recently, the i3-9100F and the i5-9400F. And with those chips, you need to understand that you have to have a graphics card in them to boot and actually see something on your screen. For the newbies, that's one of those things that there are a lot of issues, a lot of things that you possibly might have to troubleshoot. And you may want to actually consider the i3-9100 or the i5-9400. They cost a little bit more, but one less thing to troubleshoot. So along with those graphics cards, you want to ensure that the graphics card is seated correctly. You want to ensure that if it requires GPU power connectors from the power supply, that you have them connected. You want to ensure that your connections from the monitor are good. Along those lines, you want to verify that your monitor is set to the right output, the right input to match what cable is coming from the computer. All right, so other things that could go wrong related to the GPU, and this happens to me a lot because I use the same solid state drive a lot of times with multiple video cards, and it's that compilation of drivers on there that can cause issues. And what will happen is it will boot up and you won't see anything. You'll get a blank screen. This is something that could look really familiar to somebody that has the same issue with putting a 9th gen chip in and not booting up to BIOS. So ways to troubleshoot that: boot your computer up without a hard drive or solid state drive in there. All right, so we talked a lot about connectors. As far as the case to the motherboard goes, realistically, you probably only need to ensure that your power connector, the HDD LED, and some of the other connectors that go along with that may not be needed, but just to be safe, and I haven't tested this, you want to make sure that all of those connectors from the case are good. You don't necessarily need the USB 3.0 connector to be connected, just the real small ones. So looking at the power supply, obviously you want to ensure that the power supply is connected correctly, that you have your 24-pin connector firmly seated to the motherboard, that your motherboard, if it requires 2 sets of 4-pin connectors, that you actually have 2 sets of 4-pin, and that those are seated correctly, or if your motherboard has 1 4-pin connector, that it is seated correctly. We've already discussed the power connectors if your GPU requires it. Something else with the power supply, the wattage. Since you're going to have to possibly use a graphics card if you have an F-type, you want to ensure that your computer meets the recommended minimum for the manufacturer of your video card. Now, sometimes you can get away with a little less, at least to boot up, but if you later on are gaming, you'll want to ensure that you have enough power. Otherwise, your computer will reboot. However, if you don't have enough power in the beginning, I haven't tested this one, but I would assume that if you don't have enough power, your computer is either not going to boot up, or it's going to continue to reboot itself. All right, looking at the CPU. Obviously, since we're talking 8th gen, 9th gen, you'll want to ensure your motherboard is actually a 300 series motherboard. That's a no-brainer, but you'll see on Amazon and a lot of other places asking questions about a 5th gen CPU, trying to make that work with a new 300 series motherboard, or vice versa. So looking at the CPU, you want to ensure that your CPU fan or CPU cooler are firmly seated on the CPU, that the 4 points of contact are indeed secure, and that little cable at the end of it that connects to the motherboard and supplies power to the fan is connected. You'll want to ensure that there's no obstructions contacting your fans. So this could be definitely the CPU fan will shut down your computer if there's something obstructing the fan. GPU and sometimes even the system fans can do it. So, on this channel, at times I don't do the best job of house cleaning in cable management. You guys don't always get to see the end product. So just know those cables can cause you problems. So looking at your hard drive or your solid state drive, if you have that installed and it has Windows 10 on it already and it's got previous drivers, and we kind of mentioned this earlier, there can be some problems there. You may think you're saving yourself a step, and you may be creating a headache later. So just realize that there could be some problems there. As somebody that like I said uses the same hard drive a lot or the same solid state drive, just to save time to get something up and moving. Looking at those CPUs again and the motherboard, ensure there's no damage to the pins in the socket or the bottom of the CPU. Those could cause you problems and not allow it to boot. And be very careful when you're installing your CPUs. That is a place that it would be nice, I would think, if Intel and the motherboard companies could get together and come up with a better system for that. Because obviously people do damage those things. All right, so I think we've talked about most of the issues that you could actually deal with while trying to get your 9th gen computer going. So things you can do before you even order these products: do a YouTube search or Google search, type in the motherboard and the CPU, and try and find out, is the stuff actually compatible. On YouTube, obviously, my channel, I don't want to say necessarily dispelled rumors that you always need a 8th gen chip to boot to BIOS in a Z370, B360M, H370, those type motherboards, or the H310. It's not necessarily always true. You'll find some videos on my channel where I have actually had success with an old BIOS on one of those motherboards, getting it to boot up, and then going back and actually updating the BIOS with the 9th gen chip in there. And sometimes those BIOSes are up to 13 months old. And this definitely predates when they were even really talking about 9th gen. All right, so you have those aspects. You can obviously reach out to YouTubers and ask them questions. Probably not going to have much luck on the huge channels. Some of the people that are obviously more popular than yours truly on here. I'm sure at one time they used to answer just about every question, and now I don't know if they ever do. I don't have time to look at other people's channels really. I'm a little too busy as it is, but some people love answering those questions. I'll give you my best thoughts on something, but obviously only the stuff that I have can I prove it works or it doesn't. So now the last place to look